There seems to be great debate about the founding of the United States of America. Many want to make this statement that America is a Christian nation, while others contend that, and they use Jefferson as an example of that. But we read several articles this semester about just that. How did Christianity influence America? I want to look at Patrick Henry, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. In particular, I want to look at what influenced him. I would say that Patrick Henry, both in the content of his message and the style of his delivery, was greatly influenced by the Great Awakening, in particular those people like Samuel Davies and Philip Doddridge. To understand a little bit more about what motivated Henry, I want to look at a few examples and details of Henry's life. First of all, Patrick Henry was born May 29th, 1736. He was one of 9 children belonging to Sarah and John Henry. Patrick Henry was born and raised in Hanover County, Virginia. He was also named after his uncle. It's some importance because Patrick Henry's uncle was a reverend in the Anglican Church. In fact, Patrick Henry's father was a vestryman, a member of the council that governed the affairs of the parish and levied local taxes to support it. Patrick Henry and the uncle and his dad exercised considerable power over those that they oversaw. Now, Patrick Henry, not the uncle, but Patrick Henry, his mom took him to church just down the street. It was not the Anglican Church, however. It was another church. This is a significant value. Not only did Patrick Henry get taken to church by his mom, but his mom would even quiz him afterwards. What did you learn today? Now, it is important to note at this point that the church that he was going to was Samuel Davies Church. So, when we start talking about what influenced Patrick Henry, it can be kind of a challenging conversation. One of the main reasons that this is challenging, well, there's a couple reasons. One of them is that Patrick Henry did not leave much behind as far as a written record. Patrick Henry is considered one of the greatest orators, if not the greatest orator that this country has produced. Yet we don't have copies of his speeches. We don't have personal diaries and thoughts. And often when there were, his wife burned him at his death. This is not anything new to deal with. In fact, his very first biographers all lamented, as have all of them since, that how frustrating it is for so little primary information about Patrick Henry and things that were actually penned by him. The other reason is something that Thomas Kidd brings up. He says, "It is difficult to discern how passionately Henry held his own faith as a young adult. And this is because, as was typical with other Virginia colleagues of his, like George Washington and James Madison, he was reticent in defining his own devotion to Christ. We may certainly conjecture, given his background in the Great Awakening and career-long emphasis on religion and virtue, that Henry's own piety was quiet but steady, a source of his fundamental beliefs about human dignity, rights, and virtue." Human rights and virtue were extraordinarily important to Patrick Henry. So let's look a little bit about the general things that influenced Henry. Henry came just at the end of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, of course, is a period that saw an increase in revival, an increase in the population who took their faith in the gospel, who took their adherence and to a pious lifestyle as something to now be important. The Great Awakening was also central in Virginia. George Whitefield, in fact, a famous preacher, he even came to Hanover County. Patrick Henry, the uncle, who was in charge of a Anglican church, he commented on the intrigue of the population. George Whitefield came to Hanover County and preached a sermon at Patrick Henry's church in 1745. Patrick Henry would have been about 9 years old when this had happened, so he may have even remembered George Whitefield coming to his church. Patrick Henry, the uncle, the Anglican pastor, recalled that all the people, to a man, had a great desire to hear the famous Whitefield. Henry, the uncle, was not particularly impressed with Whitefield, nor did he really want to give him the ability to preach. But there were so many people that wanted to go, he just knew he couldn't stand in the way, so he allowed it to happen anyway. Also coming out of the Great Awakening and the revival that was happening, Jonathan Edwards comments from his church saying the spiritual revival that was talking about the spiritual revival that was taking place. Edwards wrote that in his church there was a glorious alteration, and that congregants would be in tears while the word were preached, some weeping with sorrow and distress, others with joy and love. Now looking at the general culture in 18th century. For the argument that the Bible wasn't as important as some want to make it seem, we have to recognize that the 18th century was full of literacy and biblical literacy. Patrick Henry himself deployed biblical phrases and Bible-like language to great rhetorical effect, communicating the gravity of the moment and the righteousness of the patriot's cause and the promise of God's sustaining aid. The Americans remained biblically literate, and contrary to the claims of the modern scholarship, the Bible informed public culture. Biblical language pervaded the rhetoric of not only the pious founders such as Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Jay, Roger Sherman, and John Witherspoon, but also those figures most influenced by the Enlightenment, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. So, outside of the generic influence of the Great Awakening in the culture of the 18th century, there are some very specific influences. Most notably, Samuel Davies. Samuel Davies was a preacher in Hanover County, and as I've already mentioned, Patrick Henry attended his church as a child, and his mom would quiz him upon what he was hearing. What's important is that we know that Patrick Henry attended Samuel Davies' church. We know that Samuel Davies was a fantastic orator, and that then Patrick Henry was as well. But what's interesting about that is Patrick Henry is said to communicate more in the style of preachers than in the style of politicians. So clearly Patrick Henry must have had a tremendous respect for Samuel Davies, and Samuel Davies must have then provided the foundation for Patrick Henry's literary or oratory style. Outside of that would be the content of his messages. Patrick Henry always championed human rights, the rights of people. Now, we know Samuel Davies also was a pastor to the slaves, that he promoted literacy and worked in the slave population. Now, Patrick Henry, although he owned slaves and never fully brought any sort of measure for emancipation or anything like that, it was inner turmoil for himself, and there's a letter he wrote to a friend that he describes the fact that he believes what they're doing is wrong, and I believe that that is an influence of Samuel Davies and biblical literature in his life. Another influence would be Soame Jenyns. They wrote A View of the Internal Evidence of the Christian Religion. Patrick Henry used this book of Jenyns, and he used it to defend Christianity in an enlightened age. This book, and this is from the book, that from this book called the New Testament may be collected a system of ethics in which every moral precept founded on reason is carried to a higher degree of purity and perfection than in any other of the ancient philosophers of preceding ages. Every moral precept founded on false principles is entirely omitted, and many new precepts added, particularly corresponding with the new object of this religion. Henry utilized this text to defend Christianity in an enlightened age. Not only that, but he used Philip Doddridge. One of his favorite books was called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul by Philip Doddridge. Doddridge's book is an example of the serious thought and commitment to faith that had grown in the 18th century, and something that Henry took seriously. This starts to come out in his relationship with Thomas Jefferson, with Patrick Henry's relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Henry had been friends growing up. They were colleagues together, although there was a slight age difference. Henry was older than Jefferson. Jefferson recalls about Henry, he says that we had a very familiar intercourse for upwards to 20 years. We nearly ran our course together. It was during our political principles being the same, we acted in perfect concert until the year 1781. I witnessed the part he bore in nearly all the great questions of that period, and perhaps could recollect some anecdotes not uninterestingly. He was certainly a man who gave the first impulse to the ball of the Revolution. And it was. Henry is famous for his speech, "To give me liberty or give me death," as he called for the Revolution. He was the first among founding fathers of the country. But as Henry and Jefferson had their falling out, there was still communication between the two of them. And one of the most telling things that really conveys the message of virtue that Henry took from Philip Doddridge, from Jennings, from Samuel Davies, from the culture of that was the Enlightenment, as he says to Jefferson in a letter, "Do you remember any instance where tyranny was destroyed and freedom established on its ruins, among a people possessing so small a share of virtue and public spirit?" Patrick Henry knew the key to success: virtue and public spirit. And Patrick Henry's idea of virtue is derived from the Great Awakening, from men like Philip Doddridge in his writing, and from others like Samuel Davies. Patrick Henry was clearly influenced by Samuel Davies, Philip Doddridge, and the Great Awakening. Patrick Henry is an incredible man that stood on his convictions. He's among the greats in American history. Thank you.